I'm a herbalist, so a lot of my students are a little bit weird, like myself, which I like. So she's been trying sort of a ceremonial dose. Cacao ceremonies, I'll talk about that a bit later. They're a bit of a modern reinvention. There's no sort of historical through line. The modern cacao ceremony is definitely a 20th century reinvention or reimagining of things. But anyway, taking a ceremonial dose of cacao, this is what she wrote. I asked her permission to divulge this to you today. So, and by the way, this student of mine is an esoterically minded person, very familiar with doing visualization, and actually grew up in a very magical tradition, not in the UK. So, but has moved away from that and is lately sort of starting to reconnect to their roots. So first of all, I heard a man singing in the darkness behind my head. This is when taking a ceremonial dose of cacao, just sitting down, eyes shut, visualizing. Nothing unusual, as I often hear someone singing when I do this sort of thing, and they are often behind me. I then felt a brightening in my mind and my chest opened up to a dark void. Lots of turquoise blue birds with long wings and tails with some small flashes, perhaps of black and white on them as well, flew up and out. I couldn't identify what kind of bird they were as they were flapping and flying so quickly. There was the sense of something massive, expansive and unknown in the dark in front of me, as far as I could sense in all directions, although I couldn't see anything. It wasn't frightening, and I had a sense of excitement and butterflies that you get when you've been looking forward to meeting someone. A man appeared in front of me and between me and the presence. I said hello and asked him if he was my guide. He just smiled, so I asked him his name. He said Ixchel, which confused me, as this of course is the name of a goddess. So I asked him again and he said the same thing. I asked a third time and he said the same again. The face of another man appeared briefly behind him with white face paint. The first man told me that now wasn't the time for me to connect with cacao as I was trying to. He told me to just relax and enjoy the feeling, knowing that the cacao was doing some healing. I felt like there was a hand supporting my heart, holding it from below. I said thank you and heard some more singing and then finished the meditation. I sat where I was by the fire and felt very relaxed, and the cacao felt very gentle. I think the dose she'd taken was about 45 grams, which is pretty standard. Then the nasty headache and facial nerve and dental pain I'd had on Friday, which ended up lasting about 3 days, returned. The pain in my teeth on the left side was bad and I could feel it pulsing in my teeth, but I felt I wasn't ready to get up yet to take something. The pain passed away quite shortly afterwards anyway. Then I fell asleep. Unfortunately, my partner fell asleep too, said they'd been working really hard, had a very long day, yada yada. I had a lot of strange dreams and images which seemed all jumbled. The only one I can remember clearly was the last one, where I went out into the garden and was standing on the lawn looking down at my ancient tabby cat that died just over a year ago. I was standing close to where he's actually buried. The cat was sitting at my feet in loaf mode, which he often did, and there was some kind of dark green net between us, so I couldn't reach him. When we were both awake, my partner tells me that they half woke briefly to see my ghost get up and walk out into the garden while I was still on the sofa opposite, but I looked okay. They figured maybe they were dreaming, and they were so tired that they drifted back to sleep again. So this prompted a question for her. Does cacao cause astral projection? What is this? So I thought this was fascinating, because while this may not be, this is somebody who's somewhat familiar with cacao's mythology. I talked, the birds they mentioned, I thought very clearly Quetzal birds, which are linked to the mythology of cacao. And as I'll talk about, cacao has a long history in its indigenous mythology of being associated with the underworld. And with connection with ancestors and stuff like that. So it's really interesting that she went out and visited her cat, which I thought was quite fun. Anyway, I've got that whole thing written down here, which I don't need to. So I'm just going to start a bit by talking about cacao as a sacred substance in mainly Mesoamerican indigenous mythology, and then a little bit about its use in ceremony today. So this, I think, I couldn't swear to it, but I think this is an illustration from, I'm not sure if it's Aztec, which Mexica. Aztec is the modern name for the Mexica. I'm not sure if it's a Mexica or a Mixtec illustration, but anyway, this is a little illustration of one variant of the world tree, the Axis Mundi, in Mesoamerican mythology. And you've got, this is the Big Dipper constellation, their version of the Big Dipper constellation, which in some Mayan mythology is, I can't remember the name they give it, but it's a big bird that sits in the world tree. And I think this tree seems to me like a cacao tree. So you've got these little rugby ball-like pods, and cacao is very distinctive. The pods grow directly from the trunk in a form of growth called cauliflory, which is not super common in the in the world of botany. It happens, but when cacao was first brought to Europe, a lot of the engravers who hadn't actually seen the tree thought that people from the colonies who had drawn the tree had made a mistake. So they kept sort of auto-correcting the things and putting the pods on the branches when it's not. Anyway, so this is, you can see the pods growing off the branch of the tree. And here are two guys performing an auto-sacrifice. This is them it's slightly exaggerated. They're cutting their penises and spilling blood, and you've got this 1950s comic book looking portal opening behind them. And this was part of the function of Mesoamerican ritual, as with many rituals, is to open a portal to the other worlds below and above. So you've got cacao here as a tree associated with that. There are many other trees that were associated with that in Mesoamerican mythology. The most common one that was associated with the world tree was the ceiba, but cacao is sometimes depicted as a world tree. This is one of my favourite illustrations. This is from the Codex Borgia, which I think is 11th or 12th century, maybe a bit later. I mean, the Mesoamerican mythology spans centuries, so I kind of like just picked on bits which I thought were cacao related. Now this, according to most modern archaeologists, ethnographers, is a depiction of something like the beginning of the world, or the origin of the world, where you've got this skull-faced thing in the middle with a death god bursting out the top there, and these little things which are translated in Nahuatl as, I think it's, have I written it here? It's sort of, it's night wind is what they represent. So you've got these little monkey homunculi and the snakes, serpents. So what I think this is actually depicting is a bowl of foamy chocolate, and there are several reasons for that. First of all, we've got this little brown head of froth, and most traditional drinks were foaming. The second thing is, and you might see it on some of the pictures later on, a lot of the traditional cacao drinks, if they're just made with cacao and water, when you froth them, the foam on the top, because it's got lots of oils in it, cacao is 50% fat like most other fatty nuts or seeds, causes little rainbows to appear in each of the bubbles if it's not mixed with maize or anything else. And there's an idea in Mesoamerican mythology, thousands of years of it, of the rainbow serpent, this connection between snakes and rainbows. Because snakes, as in many cultures, were bridges between the worlds. They were symbols of the potential for transformation and death. I always think of it as a sort of giant game of snakes and ladders. And what they talked about when they're doing rituals to open portals was they described the vision serpent. You would summon the vision serpent, and the imagery was that it'd be sort of the mouth of the serpent from which ancestors would emerge from the underworld. So serpents were seen as conduits. And it struck me as interesting that in Mesoamerican traditions, rainbows were explicitly linked to serpents. And then I was drinking some cacao one day, traditional formula, and I recognised when I held it under the sun, every single bubble had a little rainbow in it. So I just thought, interesting, I wonder. I mean, I go into, in the big book, I go into, there's a whole 2 chapters on this, so I'm not going to cover 2 chapters worth of material and 14 years of research in one talk, but there's a lot there anyway. So the Maya, different Maya had different names for it, but the Tzotzil Maya specifically had this term Itz, which is blessed substance of the sky, or I think of it as magic stuff, which flowed out of gateways to the other world opened by the Itzam or shaman. And Itz was seen as so you had this idea of Chulel, which was soul stuff, which was present in the nebulae, in the stars, and in the blood, which was condensed in ritual when the gateway was opened. And it was also present in certain natural materials like resins, blood, sap, nectar, honeycomb, milk, sweat, tears, semen, and cacao. I think these are all materials which are often viscous, maybe transformed state. They either represent a transformation of state, like I don't know, so sap or nectar, or they can coagulate. But cacao was seen as a substance which concentrated its, and they were all therefore repositories of life force of chilel, which was the more ethereal version of it that was concentrated down in ritual. So it was transformative and invisible substance that caused change and generated new possibilities. The conquest had a name called Yolilistli, which is their name for the breath of life concentrated in the heart, and this is like perennial philosophy. It's common to many cultures. The idea of pneuma in the old Greek tradition, chi in the Chinese tradition, mana or heka is the same idea. And the idea was cacao was a naturally occurring substance which was very rich in this potentially life-giving stuff. And the Mexica poetic metaphor for cacao was Yolol Estli, or the heart, the blood. And this comes when we look about the pharmacology later. That's really interesting because there are lots of parallels there with the pharmacological action of cacao. So this is really my speculation that this is life emerging from a foaming bowl of chocolate. But I'll talk a bit more about another couple of myths now, so that might help to make this seem a little bit less tendentious. Before I do that, I just want to briefly mention the modern cacao ceremony. This guy here, some of you may know, it's Keith Wilson. He lives in San Marcos on Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And he's really the sort of 20th century pioneer of what is now become popularized as international cacao ceremonies. So there's no, I mean, Keith, cacao enthusiast, he basically channeled the information and then created the cacao ceremony. And it's really interesting. I went to a couple of his ceremonies, and he sort of gives people a big dose of cacao and then primes everybody with a talk about the actions of cacao, and then guides everybody into sort of feeling into themselves. It's like in psychology it'd be somatic releasing. It sort of guides you into feeling into any blocks, and then people enter various states of ecstasy or hysteria, or some people cry, others sort of and the cacao here is really a lubricant. It's a facilitator of that change of state, which I'll talk about in a moment with the pharmacology of cacao. But he really invented this. Cacao has a very long history of use as a sacred substance, and presumably as a ceremonial substance, but not in the modern sense where it's like you give large doses and then it affects a state change in people in the context or manner that it's done now. This is a reinvention. That's not to say that it's invalid, or that it's it's not a value judgment, but it's just to make that distinction, because I see a lot of sites where people are claiming this is the ancient Maya tradition. I'm just thinking of like some people who are trained as day keepers in the Mayan tradition just getting really annoyed if they saw that. Do you know what I mean? Just like, it's not. Anyway, so some traditional preparations of cacao. This is just the basic 101. I've got to remember to turn these or they'll burn. I think I might. There we go. It won't burn if it's gone out. So traditional preparation of cacao. Some of you may know this, so apologies if not. But seeds are harvested from the pods, and then they're piled up often in the sun, or they piled up in crates. There's different ways of, but they're usually piled up with a little bit of the fruit still clinging to them, and then they're allowed to ferment for anywhere between 24 hours to 4 or 5 days, depending. Once they've sort of fermented a little bit and all those organic acids have been produced and there's been a little bit of change, then they're usually spread out in the sun, which is what you can see on the top left there. Is there a little laser pointer here, or right? Just a no. All right, fine. So it's just spread out on the top left here. Then they are toasted, which you can see is what I'm doing here. I prefer to toast cacao on clay, not metal, because I like the way the clay gently sort of distributes the heat. This seems to potentially burn the beans a bit too much. I mean, it's me just being fussy, but the traditional method was on a clay dish like this called a comal, which is, I think, a Spanish name for it. The traditional name for it might be comali or something, but I like the way the clay just radiates the heat a bit more gently and it cooks the beans a bit more thoroughly, I think. Anyway, so here you see the beans just being toasted in the traditional manner, and then next thing, the beans are shelled and winnowed, so that can be done by hand. That's Senora Aurelia Pop on the left hand in Guatemala, just shelling the beans by hand. This is Doña Maria Garcia Vasquez in the middle, who is a vendor of a fantastic traditional beverage called bupu. It has 10 million calories of sugar added to it, but it's amazing because it's made with frangipani flowers and cacao, and it's this beautiful foamy magical thing. Anyway, so she's doing winnowing by a different technique, which is just using a little bit of light breeze to, after you've shelled the beans by hand, she's then just getting the beans and the shells all mixed together and pouring them from a height through a colander, so the wind just blows away the lighter shells and separates them from the holes that you need. And that's an alternative method of doing it indoors. I don't know this lady's name. She was the mother of Doña Rosalia, who was a cacao vendor who I interviewed. But she's blowing the shells away by hand, which is a lot more labour intensive. Anyway, like most traditional things, it's very labour intensive. This is my little setup at home, where I've got my little tiny metate, which is the grinding device, the little stone table. And once you've toasted and shelled the seeds, grind them. Grinding them takes ages if you do it by hand, although the ladies in Central America can just, they've got it down to a fine art. They can pulverise it to a liquid within an hour. Me, it takes about 5. With my limp-wristed Western gringo hands, can't get quite that power. But you eventually want to get it to a liquid, because the seeds have a lot of fat in them. And then we've got here some traditional spices. This is just a mixture of Mesoamerican spices, so this is just my own blend, but I use vanilla, chili, allspice, a herb called flower called Quararibia funebris, or Rosita de Cacao. They use in a drink called tejate in Oaxaca. And sometimes magnolia flowers if I've got them, and frangipani flowers, because all of those we use as traditional spices. So I just bung a bunch of nice smelling stuff in that was traditionally combined with the cacao, and then grind it, and then I re-grind it with the cacao, and then I leave it to set like that. And those will set into discs that can then just be broken up and added to boiling water and frothed to make a drink. And that is a method that is approximately, probably at least 3,000 years old. So yeah, but this is before the invention of cocoa powder and all of that stuff. So that'll make a drink. The one on the left is just made by that method, just getting the broken up cacao and frothing it up with boiling water or tepid water. It has to be above the melting point of cocoa butter, so it has to be 30 degrees. So you read in books like the amazing book by Sophie and Michael Coe, which are on a history of chocolate, which was a massive source for me. I think Sophie Coe spent like most of her life researching traditional Mesoamerican foodstuffs. In their book, they sort of say the Aztecs, the Mexica, drank their cacao at room temperature. I think that must be room temperature in the Valley of Mexico, because it has to be warm enough, the water has to be warm enough to melt cocoa butter, right? Otherwise it's just not going to disperse because there's such a high fat content. But as long as the water's warm enough to melt cocoa butter, you can froth it like that. This one with this mutant head of foam over here would be a little bit more like some of the traditional beverages, and I've used one of the traditional foaming agents, of which there are many, and this, I don't have time in this talk to talk about that. I wanted to talk about more of the metaphysics and the sort of spooky stuff rather than the mechanics, but that's all in the book. The foaming agent I use for this is a foaming agent which is known in contemporary Oaxaca as cacao blanco or cacao cimarron, or patashtle, or patashte. There's so many variants, different local names, but it's actually a relative of cacao called Theobroma bicolor, and they get the seeds and bury them in pits filled with water for 6 months, and they turn them once in the middle, so it's anaerobic fermentation, and they stink, obviously, like most things do if they're fermented anaerobically. But then by the end of the 6 months, when they're dug out of the pit, all the smell has gone, and these seeds, which go in just looking like normal slightly brown seeds with a coating, have become like little white rubbery balls with a sort of shriveled black husk on them, and then they're spread out in the shade, dried in the shade, and then when those seeds are ground in a ratio of approximately 1/3 of those little white fermented rubbery seeds to 2/3 cacao, and frothed very carefully in water over an hour or so, they will produce a massive head of foam. The foam thing is significant. Again, I'm not going to get too far into that, but the idea, I think one of the ideas here is things which foam. Foam is a demonstration of life, and there are various ways you can look at it. if we're being really sort of a rationalist about it, you can say that from a traditional point of view, the metaphor is that things which foam, produce bubbles, have life. Fermentation is a sign of life, right? So by whipping foam into the drink, it's sort of like you're whipping that breath of life into it, that pneuma, that whatever word you want to give it, the yolilistli from the Mexica point of view. I think the Zapotec had my favourite name for it. They called it pee, the breath of life. You're whipping pee into your drink. Anyway, so they would create that head of foam, but I think just from a magical point of view, you're sort of beating intention into it, if you like. There's something about, I mean, the laborious process of making well, food, bread, anything, but particularly cacao. It's a very intention laden. I just wanted to briefly discuss these connections. So this is one of the Maya hieroglyphs for cacao, and it's a fish with 2 dots in front of it, because in this particular Maya dialect, do not ask me which one, I am not sure, cannot remember, but the word for cacao, the word for fish was ka. So this hieroglyph is literally saying ka, and then wa. So it's a pun, it's a visual pun. But there's a famous myth which is recounted in the Popol Vuh, if any of you have seen it. The sort of Mayan, it's a book of Mayan mythology, the Quiche Maya. And that myth is the myth of the hero twins. And I will try and recount a Cliff Notes version of it for you. But essentially there were a pair of male twins, and they were playing the ball game out in the sun one day. And the noise of their game really annoyed the gods of death, because they were just all this noise on their ceiling. So they sent a messenger to invite these 2 young men down to play a ball game against them. And these twins, being full of vim and hubris, said, yeah, we'll do that. And they went down to the underworld and they played against the gods of death, and they won, and then the gods of death killed them and buried them in the underworld. So that'll learn them. But so anyway, one of these young men had been married and had 2 twin sons. So meanwhile, the two older guys who'd been buried in the underworld, the original pair of twins, I think they buried one of their bodies. They buried their bodies at a crossroad in the underworld, and at the crossroads, a tree grew up, and as happens in magical stories, one of the twins' heads, I think they mounted the head of the other twin in the tree, in the branches of the tree. I don't know why they did that, but anyway. So there's this tree growing where their bodies are buried, and one of the twins' heads is sort of in the tree, like growing out of the tree. The younger set of twins, sort of one of their sons and the other one's nephews, grow up, and they learn to play the ball game, and they start playing the ball game. And once again, they disturb the gods of death. So the gods of death are pretty annoyed at this. But I don't want to miss out an important bit. This is the problem with not being able to read the script. But before the younger set grow up and start playing their noisy ball game, there's the head in the tree at the crossroads, and the daughter of what happens is this tree starts producing beautifully tasting fruit, and so people in the underworld, all these souls of the dead, start eating the fruit, going, oh, this is lovely. And eventually the lords of death, the lords of Xibalba, hear about this tree, and the daughter of one of the gods of death, the daughter of the king actually of the underworld, goes to this tree to pick the fruit. But as she's going to pick the fruit, the head of one of the brothers that has grown out of the tree spits in her palm, and I say in the book, because myth is no respecter of biology, she becomes pregnant. So, of course, this is a problem, because I forgot to say that the gods of death had forbidden the people from the underworld from visiting this tree. They weren't supposed to be doing it. So she was going to get into proper trouble, not only because she was pregnant out of wedlock, but also because she defied her father's orders. So she knew she had to flee the underworld and get out. So she escapes the underworld, and she finds the house of the young men's mother. you know, the two twins who'd gone down and died in the underworld. She finds her and says, look, I got pregnant by one of your sons, will you take me in? And grandmother doesn't know this woman, so she gives her a bunch of magical tasks to do, like to dehusk corn in the garden and stuff like that. Anyway, she eventually lets her in the house. She accepts that she's pregnant with her grandson, and it's her who gives, that's right, she gives birth to the younger twins. Once she's escaped from the underworld, the younger twins grow up, they start playing a ball game. The gods of death get annoyed, they invite the younger twins down to play, but this time they get some magical assistance. And they know that when they win the game, they are going to get killed. So they tell one of their little magical assistants in the underworld, tell the gods of death when they have won and they kill us, to to burn our bodies, grind the residue up into ash and throw it in the river. So that's what happens. They win the game, the gods of death kill them anyway, and then their magical helper says, oh, just to make sure that they're properly gone, you need to burn their bodies and grind them to powder and throw them in the river. So that's what happens. And then a few days later, in the river appear two fish. And the fish crawl out the river and become human. And then the humans travel around in the underworld and start performing miracles of resuscitation. They they kill people in the underworld, already dead, and then reanimate them. And so eventually the gods of death hear about this, they get invited to the palace, the gods of death say, do me, and they kill the gods of death, and then they don't reanimate them, and then they reveal themselves as these reborn, younger hero twins, and then they go to the sites of where their father and uncle are buried, and discover that they cannot reanimate them, they can't bring them back to life again. So they finally exit the underworld as the sun and the moon. This is a whole part of the Quiche myth, sort of myth cycle, creation cycle. What's fascinating, and this thinking wasn't original to me, it's this guy's Groth, I can't remember his first name, but he wrote a thesis that I found on the internet, which was just brilliant, where he looked at this and gone, the whole myth is also an allegory for cacao. There's lots of layers, like with many myths. This is an allegory for the Venus cycle, you know, with Venus going to, it's an allegory for eclipses and the sun-moon cycle, you know, that we're going to the underworld and then they re-emerge. But it's also an allegory for the manufacture of cacao, because you have these guys who are roasted, ground, mixed with water, emerge as cacao, two fish, and then you have this association with reanimation. And cacao, in all the myths, it was a tree associated with the southern direction, which in Mesoamerican mythology was the direction of the gateway of the dead, of the underworld. And it was also explicitly associated with as I say, the life, the force of life, the breath of life. And maize, I always miss out bits of this story. When the younger twins went down to the underworld, they said to their grandmother, plant this maize in the garden, and as long as the maize lives, we live. And then when they were killed, hopefully I'm not going to smoke you all out with this cacao, we'll see. And then when they were killed, the maize dies, and then when they reanimated as two fish in the river, the maize regrew. So there's an interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a contrapoint, it's not the word I'm looking for, but there's an interesting parallel between cacao and maize in Mesoamerican mythology, where maize is this sort of solar symbol. And as a plant, it's an annual, it grows up, it's the basic sort of staff of life, it's the Mesoamerican bread, if you like. And then cacao is something which, it's a perennial, it grows in the shade, it's a shade-loving thing, the pods grow down. If you look at cacao pods, if you take the shells off, they even look like a maize cob in the way that the seeds are arranged. And the sort of one is explicitly, it sort of like has underworldy themes, and the other one has sunny. So one's sun, it's almost like, I'm not sure, I've not found anything explicitly in Mesoamerican mythology, but then I only did 3 6-week trips over there. I haven't lived there. I never got admitted to like the inner sanctum of you know, traditional societies there. But I don't know whether there might have been a traditional association of cacao with the moon. I found some myths associating it with Venus, but it seems to me to be quite sort of lunar solar type thing. But don't know, can't be sure about that. Anyway, that's my supposition. Here it's Saros or Venus cycle. Saros is your eclipse cycles. and the decapitation of the brother and putting his head in the tree in the west, is if you know a bit about your astrology and astronomy, it's the sort of the Venus setting as an evening star, and then as it gets closer and closer to the sun, it becomes invisible and then emerges as a morning star. So it's related to that as well, I think. And then this is a little engraving I just took off Tinternet, which is a drawing of the one of the pillars of the entrance of the Temple of the Owls at Chichen Itza, which is a late post-classic sort of 11th century, I think, 11th or 12th century site. And hi, listen up. Okay, so this we've got. It shows a cacao tree on the front, which is this with all the pods growing off it, and then those sort of slightly phallic-looking things here. These are actually supposed to be jade discs, which prenote or denote value. It means this is a valuable thing. Owls, as in many cultures, were associated with the dead, and you've got emerging from the base of this pillar, and this explicitly, the Temple of the Owls is a temple associated with the underworld. You've got one of the ancestors, an ancestor, and the sort of the thing that looks like little walrus moustaches, those are speech scrolls. They're showing breath emerging from it's saying something. So it's just, I'm really annoyed that I went to Chichen Itza and I didn't notice this. I took loads of photographs and I didn't photograph this, and I found this later. So there's the cacao here explicitly associated with the entrance of the Temple of the Dead at Chichen Itza. So, stuff which I am more familiar with and frankly more excited about. I love the mythology, but my favouriteest thing is the pharmacology, frankly. So, and I love the crossover between them. So, this is just the basic, and this is a diagram that's in both the books, the basic sort of structure of a cacao bean pharmacologically. Loads of fat, like with most nutty seeds, over 50% fat. Miscellaneous, which covers a lot of stuff, fibre and proteins and other bits. Then you've got the more pharmacologically exciting stuff here, the polyphenols, which everybody bangs on about nowadays because they're antioxidants, which do loads of stuff, including protecting blood vessels from inflammation, dilating blood vessels, reducing the transformation of cancer cells, and a bunch of other stuff which I'll talk about in a moment. The alkaloids, which we know that what I call Diana Ross and the Supremes, have got caffeine, theobromine and theophylline. Actually, so caffeine's definitely the Diana Ross, like that's the lead singer in most of the plants, but there's much more theobromine in cacao. And theobromine interesting because it will have very variable effects in different people. So some people will experience it as much more stimulating than others. Others get virtually nothing from it. In everyone, though, it stimulates the heart and it makes you pee more. And it has a bunch of other interesting secondary effects which are getting more and more research time now, where they're finding that it increases the level of something called microbiology, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is a compound which, when that's elevated, encourages the outgrowth of new dendrites and neurons. It helps connectivity, the circuitry in the brain and elsewhere, so that's interesting. And it also incidentally strengthens tooth enamel, which is fun. Yeah, so chocolate is not bad for your teeth, depending how much sugar it has added to it. So alkaloids, the theophylline is a bit less, so caffeine's the most stimulating. Theobromine is very variable, but it has those other interesting properties, and but strong stimulating effect on the heart and the kidneys, just makes you pee and makes your heart beat harder and faster. And then the theophylline dilates the airways and has a sort of intermediate stimulating or awakening effect between caffeine and theobromine. But there's the most theobromine in cacao and the least caffeine. But in a traditional cacao beverage, like in a quote-unquote, it's gone out again, quote-unquote ceremonial dose, which is, as I say, modern reinvention, but it's around 40 grams, you're going to get, I don't know, about 40, 50 milligrams of caffeine. So more than a cup of tea is enough. But there's a lot of theobromine. In a ceremonial dose of cacao, 40, 50 grams, you'd be getting about 500 milligrams, nearly half a gram of theobromine. So that's quite a lot. And then you've got the volatiles, that's the essential oils. That's all this stuff that smells nice when you toast cacao. Lots of vitamins, minerals, and lots of organic acids. Anyway, I shall move on. Medicinal uses. So this is just a summary that I've put in the back of both of the books. So short-term or acute. This is clinically demonstrated, and then hypothetical, where we've got a lot of preclinical trials. That means in the laboratory or where they've tortured guinea pigs or whatever, and also epidemiological, just looking at behaviours across populations. So the clinically demonstrated stuff, cacao appears to be useful as a cough suppressant, short-term use. This is all acute, so if you drank a cup of strong cacao, these effects could be expected. Against fatigue, to aid recovery from high-intensity exercise. This is a good one. If you've ever done, like, I don't know, if you're mad enough to run the London Marathon, or you do a session in the gym, or you do some heavy workout, if you have some cacao afterwards, the day after, you will likely feel significantly less cruddy than you would had you not done that. And that's probably because it will dilate the blood vessels, improve the blood flow everywhere, reduce inflammation in the linings of the blood vessels, all that stuff, mainly from the polyphenols. Helps low mood with intention, and I think I mentioned this research later, but this is coming. I will circle back to the magical stuff, because I wanted to bring in the bit of the myth, talk about the pharmacology, and come back to magical stuff, because intention is key. Potentiating paracetamol's analgesic effect. If you've got a headache, you need to take some paracetamol or whatever. Helping sleep deprivation. This effect, interestingly, seems to be stronger in women than in men. So it seems to help sleep-deprived females more than males. And then trigeminal neuralgia, which is very specifically pain in the trigeminal nerve in the face, which sometimes happens after people get botched dental surgery, like wisdom teeth removal that goes wrong, or whatever. It's very, very painful, and cacao helps with that pain. And then hypothetical, it could help with angina, with cramps, potentially prevention of DVT. Wouldn't use it for treatment, that's an emergency. Food sensitivities, intermittent claudication, which is cramps in the thighs due to atherosclerosis, clogging up of the blood vessels. Portal hypertension, there is some clinical evidence for that. That's when people have liver disease and they get raised blood pressure, and they often get a ascites or a swollen belly. Cacao will help with that because it dilates all the blood vessels. And potentially PTSD, which I'll talk about in a moment, and sickle cell anemia crisis and prevention and social anxiety. Longer term, again, clinically demonstrated, it helps to prevent furring up of the blood vessels. Chronic fatigue syndrome, there's a very small clinical trial for that. I'd love to see a larger one because that's hella difficult to treat, but it's very beneficial for that. Coronary stroke and coronary heart disease prevention, huge data on that epidemiologically. Gestational hypertension, which means high blood pressure in pregnancy, which can become life-threatening for both the mother and the baby. Liver cirrhosis, high blood pressure in general, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and ultraviolet skin damage. All of those things have been demonstrated. Regular consumption of chocolate, dark chocolate, improves all those things, reduces the risk. So, and then hypothetically, ALS. Do you remember the ice bucket challenge a few years ago? That was, ALS. Angina, asthma, cancer prevention, chilblains, COPD, which is chronic lung issues, Cushing's disease. I mean, you can read. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. This one is interesting, glioblastoma. It's a very potentially aggressive, nasty form of, all brain cancer there's no nice form of brain cancer, but glioblastoma, depending where it is in the brain, they might be able to irradiate it or remove it surgically, but if it's deep in the brain, there's very little they can do. So what they've found is that the theobromine in cacao actually inhibits glioblastoma growth, and it synergizes with one of the most common chemotherapy agents that they use for it, called doxorubicin. It augments its effect. Plus, the antioxidants in cacao increase circulation to the brain. They actually, and this is measurable in CAT scans, they whack somebody in a CAT scanner after giving them cacao, and the blood flow to the skin and to the brain is increased within 20-30 minutes of drinking it. I expect that effect will maximise 2 hours after drinking it, because that's when the peak blood levels of polyphenols. Those are both circulatory, that's the less severe, that's the, that's much more severe, that's Berger's disease. Sometimes people have to have things amputated. Sickle cell disease, smokers, preventing skin damage, varicose ulcers, vascular dementia, and weak tooth enamel. So, it does a few things. Traditional, or alchemy and homeopathy in traditional Chinese medicine. So I love this quote from Stubb, who was an early English enthusiast of cacao who wrote a book on it that's in the Wellcome Library that you can go and get out and look at if you're as mad about it as I am. He actually did some alchemical experiments with cacao where he was trying to separate the sulfur and the salt and the mercury. And the mercury is obviously just an alcohol in plant alchemy, but the spirits would be the essential oils basically. The volatile spirits. Anyway, he said when he distilled cacao spirits, he said he got a liquid as red as blood. The caput mortem, which is the salt of the salt, it's the bit that you extract it. I think you burn the ash, calcine the ashes, and then dissolve that in distilled water, and then the mineral residue of that, I think, is the caput mortem. I need to revise my plant alchemy, but anyway, it's the most dense bit of an alchemical preparation, plant alchemy. And he said that had a smell reminiscent of fat flesh when boiled. And the fixed sulfur, which is the essential oil, had an inexpressible aromaticalness on the tongue and seemed to delight and refresh the heart and stomach, but with a great resemblance still of flesh. And I thought this is very, very interesting because of the traditional Mesoamerican assertion that that cacao contained the sort of essence of the life force in the heart, and the fact, which I haven't yet alluded to, but I probably should have done, that first slide of the two guys like shedding blood from their penises, and I think women would often use their tongues, they'd use knees, elbows. The Mayan did a lot of auto-sacrifice using blood, and cacao was explicitly linked to blood and to the heart. So it was used as an oblation, as a sacrificial offering in place of blood, and it was seen to contain something of the essence of blood, and that's probably because of that sort of the it connection. Like blood and cacao were both fluids or semi-fluid substances which contained a lot of this magical potential. So I just found it fascinating, this early European experimenter, when he cooked it all down, said, oh, it smells like flesh. Very interesting. The homeopathic chocolatum, which was proved in 1989, found that some of the themes that emerged from people who took that remedy were themes of the outsider, feeling outcast, feeling anxious, emotional instability, a need to tell the truth and react against perceived deception, feeling physically cold and experiencing palpitations. These are all things which cacao itself, in its full-on pharmaceutical dosage form, might be taken to remedy. But it's interesting when you consider some of the myths of cacao, not just the hero twins myths, but other myths about the sort of journey into the underworld. And then in traditional Chinese medicine, chocolate tonifies the heart and kidney yang, and what that roughly translates to in Western medicine terms is something that regulates the adrenals and energy metabolism and promotes sexual functions and growth and strengthens resistance. All of this sounds to me like something that strengthens the vitality in the heart. It has something of that traditional sense to it. So these are some of the little trace compounds in cacao, what I call cacao's fairy dust. And you find a lot made of them in other sources where people say, oh, the cacao's got phenethylamine, so it's like being in love. Well, I wouldn't want to state it as strongly as that, because these are trace compounds. They're found in tiny, tiny, tiny amounts. They're just like a little sprinkling of fairy dust. But it seems very likely to me that they all add up. They all synergize, or at least add to each other. So some of the compounds in cacao inhibit an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A, or monoamine oxidase B. And these enzymes break down some of the happy or pleasure-generating brain chemicals like serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, melatonin, adrenaline, and tyramine. Tyramine doesn't generate pleasure, but some of these chemicals are broken down. So some of the trace compounds in cacao, like the proanthocyanins or anthocyanins, which are actually not trace compounds, those are part of the polyphenols. Salsolinol, which is a trace compound produced during fermentation. resveratrol, and these tetrahydrobeta-carbolines, which I'm manufacturing right now as I'm roasting the beans because they're not present in raw beans. All of those will inhibit these monoamines. Different ones will inhibit monoamine A and monoamine B, and those will elevate serotonin, tyramine, dopamine in the brain, which can cause state changes, mood and state changes. Activating opioid or endorphin receptors. These are, again, some of the antioxidants. You find epicatechin and catechin also in green tea, but some of these compounds will bind to opiate receptors. Likewise, some of these fairy dust compounds bind to opiate receptors. And finally, a lot of the polyphenols, and this is a big one, the cacao polyphenols particularly stimulate the release of nitric oxide, which is a gaseous compound. It does various things. Outside the brain, it will dilate blood vessels and improve blood flow everywhere. But in the brain, it reacts as it acts as a sort of hedonic modulator. In the presence of high levels of endorphins, it will actually down-regulate the amount of endorphin receptors. So if you've got loads, if your brain's flooded with endorphins, it'll actually reduce the brain sensitivity to endorphins. But if your brain has very few endorphins going on, it'll increase the sensitivity to, so I call it sort of molecular sheepdog as far as pleasure responses go. Nice to see you.
Likewise, I'll speak to you later.
Cool. All right, so that's a really interesting one, and that's a major effect because cacao contains a lot of polyphenols that stimulate nitric oxide very markedly because it underlies its sort of blood vessel dilating powers. I have a little anecdote about that. For a few years ago, I had a little weird growth on my arm. I had to wait so damn long for the appointment. In the end, I just removed it myself. But I went in at some point for a biopsy, and they biopsied it. And then I went, and they obviously numbed the area, and then they biopsy it, and I went home afterwards. And I had my usual sort of like 11 o'clock half pint of chocolate, like that I have on a Monday, like 40 grams. And then I think I was sitting down later and I just felt liquid running down my arm, and it would just begun bleeding copiously. And I just remember thinking, shouldn't have done that. I had to run around the flat like looking for something to put on it and a styptic. The point is, it's the vasodilatory effect sort of kicks in after about half an hour, and it's very noticeable. Like if you have Raynaud's or crappy peripheral circulation, a good strong dose of cacao really will increase the blood vessels. So that was a note to self. Do not ingest high levels of cacao shortly after having any kind of surgery, major or minor. So that was a little note to self. Cacao and stress. A single 50, this is all clinical trial stuff, a single 50-gram serving of dark chocolate reduced stress responses in a small group of men aged 20 to 50 years old, and they measured their cortisol, stress steroid and adrenaline spikes in response to social stress. They gave them this, I think it's called the TRIA social stress test, where they just gave them a bunch of things to do while they were in a social situation. Read up on it. And they found that a couple of hours after ingesting the cacao, the levels of cortisol and adrenaline were blunted, were reduced in response to that stress. And likewise, 30 days intake of 40 grams of just ordinary dark chocolate per day reduced urinary levels of stress steroid and breakdown products of adrenaline. And this effect, I've highlighted this, was greatest in people with higher levels of anxiety. So the more anxious they were, the greater the lowering of stress steroid and adrenaline. Temperament. This is fascinating. Had a study of just over 1,000 elderly Finnish men of similar income level and social status, averaging 76 years old, discovered that chocolate eaters overall had better health, optimism and psychological well-being. Now, of course, there's a whole thing with research here. Correlation isn't necessarily causation and all that. It could be that the people who were like that to begin with liked eating a bit more chocolate. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily go that way. But all these findings stack up. How much longer have I got, by the way? 5 minutes. Okay, great. In a small survey of 65 young university students, chocolate preference was found to be greater in the subset who believed their destiny to be predominantly under their own control. Again, causation? No, but interesting. So, less fatalism among chocolate preferers. I love these bits of research. Cacao and fear. Small feeding trial in rats, one-off ingestion of a small amount of cacao, just equivalent to about 13 grams in an adult, reduced conditioned fear responses. Conditioned fear is it's the fear you get associated with PTSD. It's like if you've been through a traumatic thing and then you get like a backfiring car causing a war veteran to duck, is the example I give in the book. So there's the social anxiety, which is usually not conditioned. There's a background sort of anxiety, and then there's conditioned fear, which is learned fear, and it reduced this learned fear response really remarkably in the animals, even more than standard doses of a benzodiazepine tranquilizer. And then this study from Italy that I love, showing that 305 new mums with prenatal stress reported more negative temperaments in their children at 6 months old, but mothers who ate chocolate weekly or daily during pregnancy rated their children's temperaments more positively at 6 months after birth. So and the more chocolate they ate, the more positively they rated their children's temperaments. So I'm like, what is this? Is this the mums were getting doped up with the chocolate? So they're like, yeah, my children are fine because they're high on chocolate all the time. Is it because it affected the children's temperaments? Or is it, again, the kind of people who liked the chocolate were the kind of people to have rated their children like that anyway? I don't know, but it's very, very interesting. And then finally we have this, which is the most magically relevant piece of research, was on cacao and intention. So this was just a journal thing. Mindful consumption of chocolate improved mood much more than non-mindful consumption of chocolate, go figure as the Americans say, or of dry crackers, whether they were eaten mindfully or not. Okay. The effect of eating chocolate on mood was compared to drinking plain water. When compared, chocolate only improved the mood of participants who actively focused on feeling better when eating it. So it did have this much more significant effect on mood, but only when people really focused on it. Now, I presume this is a low dose of ordinary confectioner's chocolate. It's not a high dose of the real thing in a big pharmacological dose, but still interesting. And then this one. This is, many of you will be familiar with this book, I think. This is Dean Radin's book, Real Magic. He reports this result, but this is the journal that he did his research in. This is the original article. So, half-ounce servings of 68% cocoa solids dark chocolate, blessed by a shaman, a Buddhist monk, or a group of meditators, eaten twice daily on 3 days in 1 week by volunteers. They were instructed to savour each piece and primed to expect optimal health and functioning and an increased sense of energy, vigour and well-being. In this double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, gold standard, the blessed chocolate produced a significant improvement in mood relative to unblessed chocolate, and this effect was strongest in those who didn't regularly eat much chocolate. So that would be expected. If somebody's totally chocolate naive, you might expect it to produce a more powerful effect. But again, the intention piece is significant. So some contemporary ceremonial uses you could put cacao to. Somatic releasing. That's that kind of psychotherapy where you're feeling into the body. This is very much akin to what Keith does in his ceremonies. Use for visualization. I think my own experience of it is cacao is an amazing cognitive lubricant. It really helps, a good dose of it really helps me think better and certainly helps me meditate better. It helps me feel things more acutely. So very good for that. Potentially for creativity and for lucid dreaming. That's the serotonin turnover. But I think if you're using it just magically in ritual in general, it would be the traditional use, the traditional association of cacao as an offering, as a source of its. Something about the association with the underworld and with opening and with containing potential transformative power. I think cacao is basically a ritual facilitator. That's why I call this talk Magical WD-40. I think its use in ceremony now as a kind of is fine, but I think it has much broader applications. I think one of the reasons it may have become so revered is because it has this supportive, facilitating effect both on the organism and in terms of thinking and visualizing, and non-physically too, but that's as far as I'm prepared to speculate ad lib. And then I did have this whole section on cacao and old world astrology, which is mainly just for my fun, where I tried to categorize it astrologically, but I don't think we've got time, do we? No? Okay, all right, I'll end it there. Okay.
Nice. Okay.